We ready?
Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our work session this evening, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Mr. Bennett, and we'll hear about the ODE integrated guidance. So, Mr. Bennett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Hecker. Good evening, Board of Directors, Superintendent Cordy. Tonight, we wanted to talk to you about something that's pretty exciting that's come out of ODE, and it's some integrated guidance aligning for student success. And I don't know if most people know this, but ODE manages a total of 108 grants that they give to schools, which is a huge number. Tonight, we're going to talk about 6 of those. And the nice thing is these 6 are all separate right now, being combined into one big process for us, which I think this is a good thing. I think it should be a huge savings of effort and bureaucracy and combine some thinking and focus into one area. So tonight, we wanted to bring you up to speed on all those topics. Oh, clicker on works much better. So you can see the objectives here tonight. Really, we wanted to bring you up to speed on some of the major grant programs and other programs that fund programs in Sherwood are either requirements of the state. Many of these you've seen before, but we wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page and aware of some of these, and then learn a little bit about the process we'll go through mainly next year to obtain these grants. And so the things we'll talk about, many of these you've seen before. These are federal and state grants. We have a continuous improvement plan, which is essentially a process we have to go through to draft a strategic plan. Many of you have seen the Student Investment Account and High School Success Act or Measure 98 before. We'll talk a little bit about some CTE grants and a couple of other programs that fit into these. And one thing to note, school funding has changed quite a bit in the last few years. We've had a pretty significant increase in school funding, largely because of the High School Success Act and the Student Investment Account are the 2 main ones. What's been different is instead of adding money to the state school fund to increase school funding, the legislature and or the voters are adding it in the forms of grants, each with specific requirements for how to implement those. So we'll talk about some of these tonight and a little bit about each one of these programs. But managing each of these as separate programs has been a big lift. Managing them as one program, significantly more streamlined for districts around the state. So we're really glad ODE is taking on this important work for us. By the way, as I know you all know this, but as it's a work session, if you have questions or anything, just be sure to jump in and ask. So the first one of these 6 acts we want to talk about is the High School Success Act. This was created by Measure 98 by the voters in 2016. It gives us $800 per high school student each school year. It is now fully funded, which is a good thing. That's about $1.34 million for Sherwood, so a substantial amount of money. It has 3 goals, and you can see what those 3 goals are. Increase high school graduation, try to get more equitable access to advanced coursework so that all kids have access to those challenging courses, and to improve high school graduation rates. And this was an interesting grant for us because these were areas of strength for us going in. We've had a grad rate consistently about 97%, which is among the highest in the state. We've had a strong career and technical education program, and we've got some real strength around preparing kids for college and career. And I just looked up some statistics today, or actually asked somebody at the high school to help me out to get this, but I wanted you to know this. We have a lot of dual credit classes at the high school and issue a lot of credits. And the statistics from those I think are truly amazing. In 2018-19, Sherwood High School students earned 6,023 college credits while they're in high school for essentially very little money. In 1920, the first year of the pandemic, they earned 7,116. Last year, during the middle of all the chaos that ensued, 6,161 college credits, and so far this year, 4,729 college credits in the first 2. So that's a significant amount of credits kids are earning and significant savings for them going forward. So this grant helps us in areas of strength, and it's helped us get stronger. So this grant pays for things like some additional CTE teachers, a drug and alcohol prevention counselor and specialist, college and career readiness personnel, the college and career center personnel, dropout prevention specialists, credit recovery specialists, and an administrator to oversee all the programming. So significant investments, and there's more than that all included in this act. But it's been a really helpful act. And just a few years after this passed, high school grad rates around the state started to increase. So it seems to be helping. It's hard to connect that a one-to-one correlation, but grad rates are rising. Dr. Adamson?
Yeah, thank you. I just, one of the questions that I'll have at the end, and maybe you can speak to this along the way, is any chance that this, I mean, all of these separate programs, they're similar, but they all have their unique reasons for being in the world, and some of their uses are statutory and not all of them are overlapping. Is there any chance that this activity by ODE will increase flexibility with some of these funds, or are we going to reduce the administrative burden but still stuck with the specific requirement fund by fund?
We will be stuck, as far as I know, we'll be bound by the requirements of each grant. In fact, ODE is kind of threading a pretty, I don't know what the word is, threading the needle between bringing together grants that have federal requirements, state requirements, some by the legislature, some by the voter, very vastly different things, and bringing them all into one process. The guidance is actually, a 2-inch binder worth of stuff just to tell us what the rules are, but it's much better than several 1-inch binders, if that makes sense, just in terms of the regulations.
Progress is good.
Yeah, it's a
even
big
if
step
it's
in the
not
right
the ideal.
direction.
Yeah.
And we are grateful for all of these funds. So we'll jump through we'll go through the process happily.
Sorry, I just dared to dream there for a moment. Thanks for bringing me back to reality.
So the next one is the Student Success Act. This is actually the biggest one. This was created by the legislature and is funded by the corporate activities tax. And it brings in about $3.58 million to us this school year. That's a significant investment. You can see the goals of this is to meet students' mental health and behavioral needs, and to reduce disparities and increase academic for all students with a focus on what they call the focal students. And the focal students are defined in this act as students of color and tribal or indigenous students, students who experience disabilities, emerging bilingual students, students navigating poverty, homelessness, and foster care, and any other student group that has historically experienced academic disparities. And so this grant has a big focus on what they call the focal students. This has paid for a lot of different positions for us and helped us to do a lot of different things in our district. Just to give you an idea of things that are paid for by this grant, we have some instructional assistants and a teacher on special assignment that form a behavior team that help a lot of our elementary kids who are struggling with self-regulation and behavior. That was a significant challenge for us prior to the pandemic, and we made some great strides in that at the beginning of this act. Our whole elementary STEM program is paid for out of this grant. We had an additional elementary PE and music teacher. We have mental health personnel, 2 at the district level and 1 each at the high school and middle school. An additional teacher at Hawksview to keep class sizes small at our Title I school, an associate principal at the Ridges, avid elective teachers, MTSS coordinator, and more. And a big one that will come soon is a community engagement specialist paid for out of this. And when you learn when Josh in a few minutes talks about the process we'll have to go through, there's a significant community engagement process with this. And so having a community engagement specialist and communication specialist will be key on that. The other are maybe smaller in size, but equally important. Every year we have to go through every 3 years, every district in the state has to go through a continuous improvement plan process. When we went through the process prior to 3 years ago when we did ours, the state streamlined the process and just allowed districts to submit their strategic plan without going through the formal process. And then we went through a more formal process with the SIA plan. This year, we'll have to go through the complete, more formalized process, which is pretty in-depth. But combining it with the engagement processes for all these other grants will make it so much more manageable than it would have been in the fall of 2019 for us. So this is really a good thing. And this is really about developing a multi-year plan on research-based practices by involving your community, getting multiple perspectives, looking at some equity-centered data, and making some strong decisions about planning for the future years. So this piece probably should have been first in these initiatives because it will sit as the umbrella over all of these other pieces that fit together. The other ones, we also receive about $30,000 a year in funding for career and technical education. This funding is largely based on the number of students who are CTE completers. So those are students who take 6 courses or earn 3 credits in one CTE pathway. We also get some extra points for students who earn certain certificates or credentials. And these funds are largely directed to our CTE teachers, and they use them in the ways listed on the sheet there. It doesn't bring in a lot of money, but it brings in important money, and it helps keep those programs funded in ways that it would be a challenge for the ongoing way for the district. The next one is the early indicator intervention systems. This is a new grant. It's a smaller grant. It brings in somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000 a year for us. And the basis of this grant is there are certain things that are very predictive for students of not graduating from high school. And so what we want to do is we want to look at predictive data. That's why it's italicized there. And so if we see students in late middle school, early high school that are chronically absent, which means they're missing more than 10% of the school days, or failing one or more core classes, or being suspended or expelled from school, things of those nature, those can be highly predictive of struggling to graduate from high school. And so the idea is to develop these warning systems early, learn who these kids are, and intervene while you still have a long runway. And so we've invested a lot of these funds in our tech department to develop a database called EdFi, which has been really productive. It was actually up and running pretty well before the pandemic, but the pandemic really challenged our tech department. And so we're working on getting that back up to speed. But that's a huge piece for us. And that's what a lot of what we spent this grant on. And this is an important grant. We do all this work, but it's much easier to have the data in one place than to have to gather data from multiple sources to pull all this together. And in this database, you can even set research-based metrics that says, give me every student who's failed one core class and missed more than 10% of the days. I want to see them all in one report. And when it's completed, it will be able to do things like that, which will be very helpful for us. And you can get more granular than that with the metrics.
Are these, is the funding $350 per student as in all of our students, or is it on an ADM-E or ADM-W, or just the kids that show up as ones that are going to be in our kind of early warning system? Or
It's all of our students. I honestly am not 100% sure if it's ADM-W or ADM-R, meaning if it's the number of students in the district or if we get a weighted percentage for that. I'd have to look into that. Based on the size of the grant, I'm thinking it's ADM-W, but I'd have to look into that.
that's great. Thank you.
And the final program is less of a program and more of a focus. Attendance and chronic absentee is so connected with success in school that ODE put together a program. I think in 2016, they started this Everyday Matters, which was bringing together research and guidance on how to reduce chronic absenteeism. And chronic absenteeism is woven through the High School Success Act and through the Student Investment Account and the Student Success Act and into school success. And so they have just included weaving this piece of work that they've done into these other initiatives because it weaves its way through all of them. And it's so important. We don't get any funding for it. There's really not major requirements around it, but it's worth weaving those strategies into our work as we go forward and trying to reduce chronic absenteeism because it makes a huge difference for kids. So that's some background on the 6 programs that they're aligning, just kind of the basics. And I'm going to turn it over to Josh if there's no further questions, and he's going to walk you through the process we'll go through next spring and really we've already started talking about it now. Questions? Okay, I'll turn it over to Josh. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Good evening, Chair Hecker, Board of Directors, and Superintendent Dr. Cordy. You may be wondering, 108 grants, why these 6 are they integrating together? Which is a good question if you're thinking that. Although all of these programs that we've been talking about here have different goals, application procedures, and accountability measures, they all have some overlap. Specifically, they focus on increased community engagement and attention to focal students. This slide, I think, is helpful because while Gary went through each of those 6 programs that we talk about, you can kind of see where they begin to have common elements and common goals. So the programs are listed there. And within that, they have the common elements of authentic engagement, equity-based decision-making, focus upon focal students, as Gary mentioned, who have been historically marginalized by the education system, comprehensive need assessment, and a continuous improvement cycle. All of those feed into those 4 common goals that you see there on the slide: providing a well-rounded education for all students, advancing equity work within Oregon schools, community engagement, and strengthening systems and capacity for learning. The Oregon Department of Education released guidance this past February regarding the integrated guidance process for the identification of grants that will then streamline this process into a single thread, if you will, with the goal of aligning the strategic initiatives that overlap in these programs, particularly, as it's already been mentioned, around reducing bureaucracy. And as part of this, the district will be required to complete an engagement and planning process like we've never seen before and develop a 4-year plan that will then be submitted next winter, early spring. And so I want to walk us through just the timeline because there's some significant pieces to this. So I've already mentioned the guidance was released. Gary kind of gave you the visual. It's more like this. It's quite a thick binder, and there have been sessions happening across the state around that guidance as it rolled out in February. We're talking about it now because this will kick off very early in the fall with community engagements and needs assessments. This is well beyond anything the district has ever done before. It's really getting community stakeholders to give input, not just small, focal groups like we have done in the past. And then as we move into later fall, winter, I know it says fall, winter 2022, fall 2022, moving into winter of 2023, we will then begin to put together a development plan that requires us as a district to have an equity lens, which is actually submitted then to Oregon Department of Education, along with our application. And then in early winter, we will be finalizing the budget, that plan, putting together an application. Thankfully, it's 1 application, not 6. And then we'll be posting that for community feedback, seeking board approval of that plan. And then in March, we will, when the application window opens, we'll be doing a review process so that we can, there's a typo there, submit in late April into June, and then ODE reviews the process that we have put together as part of our application, and then will come back to us with any feedback. So it's a kind of drawn out process to be doing this.
So Dr. Fritz,
Yep.
when is that application due? Is that in March then?
It's actually due, they have not put hard dates, but what they've
Okay.
been talking about is at the end of March. So what I would imagine is we will be back together as a group around February, early March to be talking about that with the board. And then we will submit that to, and I'm going to kind of go through some more of those pieces. And then we'll submit that for feedback from ODE and then probably have to make some changes based on their input.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. This next slide, this shows you that it's not just this one-time process we're talking about for next year. This is what they're calling the long-term rhythm. And so what we will be doing is planning out for 4 years so that this will become a cyclic piece that we're working on. And we will be doing this. That's a continuous improvement piece of this, is that we will continue to do this year after year and refining our plan and really always be in this process, if that makes sense.
I'm really
Want me to go back?
fascinated by going back a step to this chart. Oh, no, one more forward. You're good. Thank you. Because what I really hope we don't do, I am used to this kind. I work in healthcare, and healthcare has done community health needs assessments and then build community health improvement plans in what's a very similar cadence to this. And the good part of that about that is that there's a ton of community engagement and real research on what are the actual needs of the community, and then directed investment into those needs instead of kind of just bouncing around at whatever was the most interesting thing at the moment. And I'm hopeful that we can achieve a very similar outcome in education. It's something that I think Sherwood has modeled for a long time, but that for other districts that tend to bounce around based upon whatever the most interesting thing is at the moment, that this will be a more directive process. The thing that I am interested in, and I won't be here when we get to the end of the first 4 years. I'll be here through next year, but the end of that 4-year planning, some programs will take that long. And what I'm hopeful of is that our community and the board will have the stamina to stick with it for that period of time. Because the easy thing would be is, okay, well, we've already done that and we've had a year or so of ramp up, and then we'll do the assessment again and then let's ping to something else. But the importance of being able to finish those 4 years and really be able to build on the plan's success is going to be really important. Otherwise, we'll only do the easy stuff and never get about the really hard things that take 2 to 4 years to implement.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's useful, but that's the thing I'm worried about.
I appreciate you saying that. And one of the things that I think I'm optimistic about in this new rollout is in the past, we've had continuous improvement plans. And so what would happen is you do your plan, you submit it, and then you don't have to do it again for 3 years, or we heard about in 2019, don't do it, just submit your strategic plan. As you can see from this slide, there's that overlap. So right now we're in pre-planning, right? But even after we get our plan approved, we're in that execution of that plan. But at the same time, we're already moving into planning for the next plan. So it becomes hopefully much more fluid, and that we really truly are focused on continuous improvement, not what's the latest fad, right?
Thank you.
All right. This other graphic here, I think that's really helpful is this is what the ODE has mapped out as a 12-step plan for this application process. I think the first time I saw this, it was kind of almost a panic, like, oh, we're going to do all of this in the coming months. But I do think it's really helpful to kind of see those steps that are there, really preparing. Then we move into engagement, doing that complete needs assessment and bringing together all grants and all of our community stakeholders, reviewing the process, identifying outcomes, as well as identifying the strategies. How are we going to reach those goals? Seeking out feedback. So even though we may be eliciting community input at the beginning, once we get a plan going, we also then want to seek out additional feedback, gathering and generating the activities that will get us to where we need to be. And then finally, as if that's not enough, then developing our written plan along with our application to ODE so that we have other educators taking a look at it and getting feedback from them, and then we move forward. So it's that maybe not the best graphic because it's really cyclical, right? But what this lays out is how many steps are involved. This is not simply just put together a plan. These are all of the requirements for this application process. This is also a little bit different because there are other pieces that are being required that have not been required in the past. One I mentioned already is the use of an equity lens. We certainly have used equity lenses, as many districts have in the past. This is different in that not only do we have to use an equity lens, we must then submit that lens to the Oregon Department of Education for their input around that. We certainly have done community engagement, but I'm going to talk more here in a minute about what that community engagement will be looking like because it's much more robust than it has been in the past. It also involves a plethora of other folks that probably we don't typically think about having at the table as we vet these plans and develop where we're headed. And that is involving tribal consultation, community engagement that disaggregates student data, and looking at quality education models, involving the regional CTE consortia. We've talked about focal students. There's just layers upon layers with this. It's not simply just having a meeting and saying, hey, give us your ideas, but it's really involving a robust group of folks. When we think about community engagement, there is a vast amount of information in this guidance that's come from the Oregon Department of Education around what that even looks like. Again, we've talked a bit about focal students, but also including families, parent organizations, and site councils. And then it gets into artifacts, which was an interesting thing that they talk about really, truly robust artifacts. So it's not simply a sign-in sheet. So we have a sign-in sheet at the door this evening that will list who was here. The Oregon Department of Education is saying, no, there must be meeting minutes, there must be student work examples. So we're getting to a much deeper level of engagement. As far as the people that are around the table for this community engagement, it also means that we're making sure that community-based organizations, community leaders, and faith-based organizations, as well as tribal members, early learning and childcare providers in the community, ESD regional liaisons, representatives from agencies serving at-risk and homeless populations, representatives serving youth and foster care, representatives serving our military families, STEM hub and regional educator network representatives. I could go on and on. There are several pages around the guidance. I just want to give you a sense of how robust this is and how many different stakeholder groups need to be part of this. Currently, the Student Success Act, SSA, only requires engagements of staff, families, and focal students. So this is really expanding the voices that are at the table when we seek out input. And ODE is in the rulemaking process to add all of the above groups into their guidance even further. And so it's a little unclear how detailed or exactly what type of artifacts, that's the word they use, we will need to have in there, but it's certainly what we're understanding is it's a much deeper level of community engagement than in the past.
I have a question about tribal consultation.
Yeah.
That is brand new. And that's, I mean, it's a wonderful addition. There's a very specific government to government process to achieve that. How is ODE ensuring that, given that there's almost 200 school districts and only 9 federally recognized tribes, that there's enough resource for there to be a timely consultation and engagement with each district that may have more than one tribe that it needs to engage with?
Yeah, that's a perfect question that I don't have an answer to. And I honestly, and I kind of chuckle because I was in a ODE session last week and that almost word for word came up as a question. There were several other examples and there is no clear guidance around that. And the response was, well, districts will need to work with their community stakeholders. What I would imagine for us is going and first looking at who is in our community and how can then we partner out with those particular groups that represent our students. From a tribal perspective, I imagine they're not going to be able to engage with every school district in the state, but I would hope that we could really put credence on trying to build those relationships and get those input from those groups.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Other questions, comments? Anybody want to read this manual?
More than I would like to read the 6 manuals that existed before. I really do want to say, I think this is a great thing. I think this will save us a lot of effort and time and resource. And I'm pleased that we're moving forward, and I'm remain ever hopeful that we'll get to a place where the requirements fund by fund will become more less specific, I think is probably the best phrase, and more flexible to allow districts to meet the needs of their individual communities. But this is definitely a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you very much. Okay, with that, we will close this portion of our meeting and we